Reinvent Your Life. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. There comes a moment in life when everything feels normal on the outside, but something inside quietly breaks. You wake up, go to work, handle responsibilities, and repeat the same cycle. Yet deep down, you realize you are not moving forward the way you once expected. Time is no longer slow. It is passing faster than your progress, and the gap between your dreams and reality is getting harder to ignore. You start remembering the life you once planned, the goals, the excitement, the version of yourself you promised to become. But now responsibilities are heavier, energy feels lower, and starting over feels more difficult than ever. And without even noticing, a silent fear begins to grow. What if it's already too late to change anything? Stay with this journey, because what you are about to discover may change the way you see your entire life and show you how to reinvent it, step by step, before time decides for you. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The weight you carry every day. Most people do not realize how much a person can carry without breaking on the outside. Life does not always show its pressure in obvious ways. Instead, it builds slowly, quietly, through responsibilities that never stop growing and expectations that never reduce. You continue moving forward because stopping is not an option, even when your energy feels completely drained. One of the heaviest burdens is financial survival. It is not just about earning money, it is about constantly thinking ahead. Rent, bills, food, education, family needs, emergencies that can appear without warning. This kind of pressure does not leave space for long rest or emotional pause. Even when you are physically resting, your mind continues calculating, worrying, and planning. Over time, this creates a mental weight that becomes normal, even though it should not be. Along with financial pressure comes family responsibility. As life progresses, responsibilities do not decrease, they multiply. Parents grow older, children or siblings depend on you, and household expectations become part of your identity. You are expected to be strong, reliable, and stable, even on the days when you feel the opposite. Many people silently accept this role without question, because family responsibility is not something easily refused. But what often goes unnoticed is how much personal energy gets consumed in the process. The result is emotional exhaustion, not the kind that comes from one difficult day, but the kind that builds over months and years. It becomes harder to feel excited about anything. Things that once brought motivation or joy begin to feel like obligations. Even simple decisions can feel heavy. You are not necessarily broken. You are simply tired in a way that rest alone does not fully fix. One of the most common coping habits in this condition is pretending. People learn to say, "I'm fine," even when they are not. Not because they want to lie, but because explaining the truth feels complicated. There is often no time, no space, or no belief that others would truly understand. So the mask becomes part of daily life. You go to work, meet people, fulfill responsibilities, and maintain the appearance of stability while internally dealing with pressure that remains unspoken. Over time, this habit of pretending becomes dangerous in a subtle way. When you repeatedly ignore what you feel, you start disconnecting from your own emotional reality. You stop asking yourself important questions, like whether you are truly okay or whether the direction of your life still aligns with your well-being. Instead, you focus only on survival and completion of tasks. Life becomes something you manage rather than something you experience. A simple example can help make this more real. Think of a worker who wakes up early every morning, goes through long hours of physical or mental effort, and returns home completely drained. There is little energy left for personal growth, reflection, or even rest that feels meaningful. At night, the body finally slows down, but the mind still carries unresolved pressure, bills to pay, responsibilities for tomorrow, worries that do not disappear easily. Then the next morning comes, and the cycle repeats. Yet despite this exhaustion, the person still gets up and tells themselves, or others, that everything is normal. This is not weakness. This is what continuous responsibility without emotional release looks like. The important realization here is not to judge this lifestyle, but to understand it. Many people live this way for years without recognizing how heavy their mental load has become. When something becomes your daily routine, you stop identifying it as pressure. You start seeing it as just life. But just because something is common does not mean it is healthy or sustainable in the long run. This is where awareness becomes the first step toward change. Before any transformation can happen, you need to recognize the weight you are already carrying. Not to feel discouraged, but to finally be honest with yourself. Because you cannot rebuild a life you are not fully aware of. And you cannot create change while denying the reality of your current condition. Reinvention does not begin with motivation or sudden inspiration. It begins with acknowledgement. The moment you admit that the pressure is real, the exhaustion is real, and the current pace is not sustainable, that is the moment change starts to become possible. This chapter is not about solving everything immediately. It is about seeing clearly, because when you understand the weight you carry every day, you also begin to understand why change is not just an option, but a necessity for the life you still have ahead. Chapter 2. Watching time move faster than your dreams. There is a quiet form of stress that does not come from failure, but from delay. It comes from realizing that time has continued moving forward, while your personal dreams have not moved at the same speed. You are still functioning, still responsible, still managing life, but the sense of fulfillment you once expected has not arrived. This feeling often starts subtly. At first you tell yourself that delays are normal. You believe there is still enough time, that opportunities will come later, and that life will eventually align with your plans. But as months turn into years, something changes. You begin to notice that your age has increased, your responsibilities have grown, and your goals remain in the same unfinished state. One of the most difficult emotional shifts is when you start feeling older without feeling accomplished. Age by itself is not the problem. The problem is the internal expectation you once held about where you should be by now. Many people carry a mental timeline of success, education completed by a certain age, financial stability by another, career progress by another stage. When reality does not match that internal timeline, frustration quietly builds. What makes this experience even heavier is the repetition of postponed goals. Dreams are rarely abandoned suddenly. They are delayed slowly. You tell yourself not now because of responsibilities, lack of time, fear of failure, or uncertainty. Each delay feels small in the moment, but together they form years of inaction. Eventually the dream is not gone, but it is no longer active in your daily life. It becomes something you think about occasionally, instead of something you are working toward consistently. Over time, life starts to feel like a collection of missed opportunities, not necessarily dramatic failures, but moments where action could have been taken but was not. A course you did not start, a skill you did not learn, a job you did not apply for, a decision you postponed because conditions did not feel perfect. Individually, these moments seem insignificant, but when you look back, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. This is where comparison becomes psychologically powerful. You begin comparing your past expectations with your current reality. The person you imagined becoming at a younger age feels distant from the person you are today. In your past imagination, success looked clearer, faster, and more predictable. But reality has been more complex, slower, and shaped by responsibilities you may not have anticipated. This comparison is not always conscious. It often appears as a quiet dissatisfaction in daily life. You may not express it openly, but internally, there is a sense that something did not go according to plan. That feeling does not necessarily mean you have failed. It means your expectations were not adjusted in time to match real-life conditions. A common example of this experience can be seen in many working individuals. Someone may have promised themselves early in life that by the age of 25 they would be financially stable, confident in their career, and progressing steadily toward long-term goals. But life does not always follow early assumptions. By 35, that same person may still be in a similar position, still working hard, still managing responsibilities, but feeling as if progress has not matched effort. The disappointment is not always about lack of work. It is about lack of visible change over time. This is where emotional pressure quietly builds. Not because life has stopped, but because expectations have not been recalibrated. You are still measuring your life using an old timeline that no longer fits your current reality. This mismatch creates frustration, even when you are objectively doing your best. However, there is an important psychological truth that often gets ignored in this process. Time itself is not moving against you. Time is neutral. What creates emotional pain is the perception that time is passing without meaningful progress in the direction you once desired. This perception can become heavier when you focus only on what has not happened, instead of what is still possible. Another layer to this experience is self-comparison. You may begin comparing yourself not only to your past expectations, but also to others. People who seem more successful, more stable, or more ahead in life can create an additional sense of delay. But what is often invisible is their own timeline of struggles, setbacks, and corrections. Comparison rarely shows the full picture of another person's journey, yet it strongly influences how you evaluate your own. At this stage, the mind can enter a cycle of reflection mixed with regret. You think about what could have been different if earlier decisions were made differently. While reflection is useful, excessive regret becomes mentally draining because it focuses on irreversible time rather than current opportunity. The past cannot be changed, but your interpretation of it can still evolve. This is where a shift in thinking becomes essential. Instead of asking why time moved without your dreams, a more productive question is how your relationship with time can change from this point forward. Because while you cannot recover lost years, you can still redefine what progress means starting now. Progress does not always require dramatic transformation. In many cases, it begins with alignment, bringing your daily actions closer to your remaining goals. The key is recognizing that delay does not equal permanent loss. It often reflects a period of survival, responsibility, or uncertainty rather than incapacity. When you understand this, the emotional weight of being behind begins to soften. You start to see that life is not a single straight timeline where you either succeed on schedule or fail permanently. Instead, it is a shifting process where direction matters more than timing. Watching time move faster than your dreams is not just an experience of aging. It is an invitation to reassess how you define progress, how you measure success, and how you choose to act from this moment onward. Because even if time has moved quickly, your ability to respond to it is still in your hands. Chapter 3. The fear you don't talk about anymore. There is a type of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It does not always come as panic or visible anxiety. Instead, it settles quietly in the background of your thinking, shaping your decisions without you fully realizing it. Over time, this fear becomes so familiar that you stop naming it. You simply start calling it being careful, waiting for the right time, or not being ready yet. This is the fear that many people carry but rarely talk about anymore. Not because it is gone, but because it has become normalized. One of its most common forms is the fear of failure hidden behind silence. At some point, most people experience setbacks, a failed attempt, a missed opportunity, or a decision that did not produce the expected result. But what stays longer than the failure itself is the emotional memory of it. That memory quietly influences future choices. You begin to associate action with risk, and risk with emotional discomfort. As a result, silence becomes a coping mechanism. Instead of openly discussing your ambitions or plans, you keep them inside. You stop sharing your goals, because speaking about them creates accountability, and accountability feels uncomfortable when fear is present. So you reduce noise in your life, but at the cost of reducing action as well. Another deeper layer of this fear is the fear of starting over from zero. This is one of the most psychologically difficult barriers for adults. Starting over is not just about effort, it is about identity. When you have already invested years into a path, education, job experience, skills, it becomes difficult to imagine abandoning that structure and rebuilding something new. Even when dissatisfaction is present, familiarity often feels safer than uncertainty. The mind prefers predictable discomfort over unpredictable possibility. So instead of making a change, you stay within the same system, even if it no longer feels aligned with your goals. The idea of starting from zero feels like losing everything, even though in reality it may simply be repositioning yourself towards something more suitable. Then there is the fear that time has already run out. This fear becomes stronger with age, but it is not purely based on numbers. It is based on perception. You start measuring your life against internal deadlines that may not reflect reality. When you feel behind, your mind begins to interpret time as an enemy rather than a resource. This creates a subtle but powerful emotional pressure. You may feel that even if you try now, it will not be enough to make a meaningful difference. This belief does not usually appear as a direct thought. Instead, it shows up as hesitation, delay, and avoidance. You tell yourself you will start later, when conditions are better, when confidence increases, or when circumstances improve. But later slowly becomes a pattern rather than a plan. Avoiding decisions becomes another consequence of this fear. Decision-making requires acceptance of uncertainty. Every meaningful choice carries risk, because outcomes are never fully guaranteed. When fear is active, uncertainty feels threatening rather than natural. So instead of deciding, you delay. You research more, think more, wait more, but move less. This avoidance is often misunderstood as laziness, but in reality, it is hesitation rooted in emotional protection. The mind is trying to prevent another negative experience. However, while it reduces short-term discomfort, it also limits long-term progress. Life begins to feel paused, not because opportunities are missing, but because decisions are consistently postponed. A simple example of this fear can be seen in career transitions. Imagine a person who is no longer satisfied with their current job. They may feel disconnected, underutilized, or unfulfilled. Deep inside, they want to change direction, learn new skills, or move into a different field entirely. But every time they think about taking action, a thought appears. What if I fail again? This question carries emotional weight because it is not just about the future. It is influenced by past experiences, previous attempts that did not succeed, moments of embarrassment or financial insecurity during uncertain times. So instead of applying for a new opportunity, learning a new skill, or exploring a new path, they delay. They wait for confidence that never fully arrives. What makes this situation important to understand is that fear in this context is not irrational. It is protective. The mind is trying to prevent repeated disappointment. But protection, when overextended, becomes limitation. What once helped you avoid pain begins to prevent growth. The key psychological shift here is recognizing that fear does not disappear before action. It reduces after action begins. Waiting for fear to fully vanish before making a decision often leads to permanent delay. In most cases, people do not feel ready before they start. They become ready through starting. Another important realization is that starting over is rarely as absolute as it feels mentally. Life does not reset completely. Experience, skills, and knowledge remain with you, even if you change direction. What changes is how they are applied. The idea of zero is often an emotional interpretation, not a factual one. Time-related fear also deserves careful reflection. The belief that it is too late often comes from comparing your current position to an ideal timeline rather than a realistic one. But progress is not only measured by age or speed, it is measured by direction and consistency. Even delayed action still moves you forward if it is aligned with improvement. At this stage, Overcoming fear is not about forcing confidence. It is about changing your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of expecting certainty before action, you begin to accept that uncertainty is part of all meaningful decisions. This acceptance reduces pressure and allows movement to begin again. Reinvention requires action despite fear, not after fear. The goal is not to eliminate hesitation completely, but to prevent it from controlling your decisions. When fear becomes something you observe instead of something you obey, its influence begins to weaken. The fear you don't talk about anymore is not a sign of weakness. It is a natural response to past experiences, uncertainty, and responsibility. But it becomes limiting when it quietly decides your future without your awareness. Recognizing it is the first step toward reclaiming control, because once fear is seen clearly, it no longer has the same hidden power. And once it loses that hidden influence, the possibility of change becomes real again. Chapter 4. The Life You Never Expected to Be Living. At some point in life, most people experience a quiet realization that is difficult to admit even to themselves. It is the awareness that the life they are living does not fully match the life they once imagined. This realization is not always dramatic. In fact, it often arrives in silence, during ordinary moments, while working, resting, or simply thinking without distraction. The gap between dreams and reality does not usually appear suddenly. It forms gradually through decisions, responsibilities, and circumstances that seemed reasonable at the time. Many people do not actively choose a completely different life. Instead, they adapt step by step to situations that were meant to be temporary. Over time, what was once temporary becomes normal. Life rarely follows the exact path we expect. Even with careful planning, unexpected detours are common. Some are caused by financial pressure, some by family obligations, some by missed opportunities, and others by changes in personal priorities. These detours are not always negative in themselves, but they often redirect attention away from long-term goals. When you are focused on survival, stability, or immediate responsibilities, long-term dreams naturally take a back seat. You may tell yourself that you will return to them later, once things settle. But life rarely pauses to create perfect conditions. Instead, responsibilities continue to evolve, and later often becomes undefined. One of the most emotionally complex experiences is realizing that you are living in a situation you once promised yourself you would avoid. This does not necessarily mean failure in a traditional sense. It can mean staying in a job longer than intended, living in conditions that feel limiting, or following a path that no longer aligns with your original intentions. These situations are not always the result of poor decisions. Often, they are the result of adaptation. Humans are naturally flexible. When faced with pressure or uncertainty, we adjust. That ability to adapt helps us survive difficult periods, but it can also lead us away from the life we originally wanted to build. Over time, adaptation can quietly turn into acceptance, not the healthy kind of acceptance that brings peace, but a passive acceptance that removes urgency. You stop questioning whether things can change and instead start focusing only on how to manage what already exists. This shift is subtle but powerful because it changes your internal direction from growth to maintenance. Alongside this process, a form of quiet disappointment often develops. It is not always expressed outwardly. Many people continue fulfilling their responsibilities, maintaining routines, and appearing stable from the outside. But internally, there is a sense that something important has not been achieved. It may not always be clearly defined, but it is felt as a gap between effort and fulfillment. This emotional gap can be difficult to understand because life may still be functional. You may have a job, responsibilities, and daily structure. From a practical perspective, things may appear fine. But emotional satisfaction does not always align with external stability. A person can be functioning well while still feeling internally disconnected from their original sense of purpose. One of the reasons this disconnect becomes stronger is because expectations evolve over time. The dreams you had earlier in life were often shaped by optimism, simplicity, and fewer responsibilities. As life becomes more complex, those early expectations are replaced by practical considerations. Without realizing it, you begin to lower or adjust your expectations in order to cope with reality. This adjustment is not inherently negative. In many cases, it is necessary for emotional stability. However, when expectations are reduced too far or too permanently, they can create a long-term sense of underachievement. You stop aiming for meaningful change and instead focus only on maintaining what already exists. Another important factor is emotional fatigue. When life becomes a cycle of responsibility without visible progress toward personal goals, motivation naturally declines. It becomes harder to imagine change because energy is already being used for daily survival. In this state, thinking about the future can feel overwhelming rather than inspiring. This is why many people stay in situations longer than they originally intended. It is not always due to lack of desire for change, but due to lack of perceived capacity for change. When energy is limited, even small steps toward a different direction can feel difficult to initiate. However, understanding this reality is important because it removes self-blame. You are not simply someone who failed to follow a perfect plan. You are someone who adapted to real-life conditions that required continuous adjustment. That distinction matters because it shifts the focus from regret to awareness. Awareness allows you to see your current position more clearly. Instead of judging where you are, you begin to understand how you arrived there. This understanding is essential for any form of reinvention because change becomes possible only when reality is acknowledged without distortion. The life you never expected to be living is not necessarily a final outcome. It is often a temporary result of long-term adaptation, shifting priorities, and accumulated decisions made under pressure. While it may feel fixed in the present moment, it is not beyond change. Reinvention begins when you stop viewing your current situation as a permanent identity and start seeing it as a stage in your journey. When that perspective shifts, so does your relationship with possibility. What once felt like limitation begins to feel like a starting point for adjustment. This chapter is not about rejecting your current life. It is about understanding it. Because only when you clearly see where you are, can you begin to decide where you still want to go. Chapter 5. Reinventing Yourself starts with one honest decision. Reinvention is often misunderstood. People tend to think it is a process that begins with motivation, inspiration, or external opportunity. But in reality, it begins much earlier than that. It begins at a quiet internal moment when a person becomes fully honest with themselves about their current life. This honesty is not always comfortable. In fact, it is often avoided for a long time because it forces you to see your situation without excuses, without distractions, and without temporary justifications. Many people delay this moment because they are still trying to make things work as they are. They adjust, they tolerate, they manage, and they hope conditions will improve on their own. But real change does not begin with improvement in circumstances. It begins with a clear acknowledgement of reality. Facing truth instead of denial is the first and most important shift. Denial does not always mean ignoring everything completely. More often, it shows up in subtle forms. You may know something is not working, but you convince yourself that it is not that bad. You may feel unfulfilled, but you tell yourself that others have it worse. You may feel stuck, but you believe that staying patient is the same as moving forward. These thoughts are understandable because they reduce emotional discomfort. However, they also delay necessary decisions. When truth is softened too much, it loses its ability to guide action. And without action, life continues in the same direction by default. At some point, a person reaches a stage where internal discomfort becomes harder to ignore. It may not be dramatic, but it becomes persistent. There is a growing sense that continuing the same patterns will not lead to a different outcome. This is where the possibility of reinvention begins to form, not as an idea, but as a realization. Choosing change over comfort is not a single dramatic act. It is a mental decision that shifts priorities. Comfort in this context does not always mean ease or happiness. It often means familiarity. Even when a situation is stressful or unsatisfying, it can still feel comfortable simply because it is known. The mind naturally prefers what it has already adapted to, even if it is not ideal. Change, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty. It requires stepping into unfamiliar situations, learning new patterns, and temporarily losing stability. This is why most people hesitate. The discomfort of change feels more immediate than the discomfort of staying the same, even if staying the same leads to long-term stagnation. The turning point happens when a person recognizes that short-term discomfort is sometimes necessary for long-term improvement. This is not a motivational idea. It is a practical reality of growth. Every meaningful transformation involves some level of uncertainty at the beginning. The first mental shift toward rebuilding is subtle but powerful. It is the shift from passive acceptance to active responsibility. Instead of seeing life as something that is happening to you, you begin to see it as something that is influenced by your decisions, even within limitations. This does not mean ignoring external challenges. Financial pressure, family responsibilities, and social obligations are real and cannot be dismissed. But within those realities, there is still a range of choices, even if small. The mental shift lies in recognizing that those choices still exist and that they matter over time. Many people delay change because they wait for perfect conditions. They believe that they need more time, more confidence, more resources, or fewer responsibilities before they can begin. But perfect conditions rarely arrive. Life tends to remain complex even when improvements happen. Waiting for ideal circumstances often becomes a form of postponing action indefinitely. Reinvention starts when a person accepts that progress must happen within imperfect conditions. This acceptance removes unrealistic expectations and replaces them with practical awareness. You begin to work with what you have, instead of waiting for what you wish you had. Accepting responsibility for future direction is another essential part of this process. Responsibility in this sense is not about blaming yourself for past decisions. It is about recognizing that your future is still influenced by the actions you take now. The past may have shaped your current position, but it does not control the direction of your future. This distinction is important because many people remain mentally tied to their past. They replay earlier decisions, missed opportunities or mistakes, believing that those moments define their ability to change. While reflection can be useful, excessive focus on the past often reduces focus on present action. Taking responsibility means shifting attention from what has already happened to what can still be influenced. It is a forward-facing mindset. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" the more constructive question becomes, "What can I do from here?" There is a common moment in many people's lives when this shift becomes emotionally clear. It is not always planned. It often appears as a quiet realization after prolonged dissatisfaction. A person may simply reach a point where they internally admit, "I cannot continue living like this anymore." This statement is not dramatic in itself, but it carries significant psychological weight. That moment is important because it marks the end of internal negotiation. Before this point, there is usually an ongoing internal debate. Part of you wants change, while another part prefers stability. After this realization, the internal conflict begins to settle, not because fear disappears, but because clarity becomes stronger than hesitation. From that point onward, reinvention is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes a direction. The exact path may still be unclear, but the decision to move forward is made, and that decision is the foundation of all future progress. It is important to understand that this decision does not immediately change external circumstances. Life does not transform instantly after an internal shift. However, it changes the way you relate to your circumstances. You begin to see problems as solvable rather than permanent. You begin to view effort as meaningful rather than wasted. This shift in perception is what allows consistent action to begin. Without it, effort often feels pointless, leading to inconsistency and eventual withdrawal. With it, even small steps feel purposeful because they are aligned with a new internal direction. Reinventing yourself is not about becoming a different person overnight. It is about choosing a different relationship with your current life. That relationship begins with honesty, continues with responsibility, and grows through consistent action. Everything that follows in the process of change, discipline, habits, learning, rebuilding, depends on this first decision. Without it, methods remain theoretical. With it, even simple actions begin to create momentum. Reinvention starts at the exact moment you stop avoiding the truth and decide, quietly but firmly, that your future deserves a different direction than your present habits are currently producing. Chapter 6. Letting go of the old version of yourself. One of the most difficult parts of personal growth is not learning something new, but releasing what you have already become. Most people think change is about adding new habits, new skills, or new opportunities, but before anything meaningful can be built, something old usually has to be released first. Every person carries an identity built over years of experience. This identity is shaped by past decisions, repeated behaviors, failures, successes, and even how others have treated you. Over time, this identity becomes familiar. It defines how you see yourself and how you respond to life. Even when it no longer serves your growth, it still feels like you. Letting go of the old version of yourself is not a single event. It is a gradual internal process where you begin to question patterns that once felt natural. You start noticing that some habits no longer align with the direction you want to move in. What once felt comfortable may now feel limiting, but because it is familiar, it still holds emotional weight. Releasing an outdated identity often begins with awareness. You begin to recognize that certain versions of yourself were created in response to specific circumstances. For example, you may have developed habits of avoidance during stressful periods, or accepted low expectations during times of uncertainty. These behaviors were not random, they were adaptations. They helped you cope with a certain phase of life. However, what helped you survive one stage may not help you grow in the next. The problem is not the past version of yourself. The problem is holding on to that version long after its usefulness has ended. When identity becomes fixed instead of flexible, it begins to limit future potential. Breaking old habits and patterns is often where resistance becomes strongest. Habits are not just actions, they are emotional shortcuts. They reduce mental effort by repeating familiar responses. Even habits that produce negative outcomes can feel difficult to change because they are predictable. The mind often prefers predictable discomfort over uncertain improvement. This is why many people struggle to change, even when they clearly understand what needs to be done. It is not a lack of knowledge. It is a conflict between awareness and familiarity. You may know a habit is holding you back, but changing it requires stepping into a version of yourself that feels unfamiliar. That transition creates discomfort, even if it is positive in the long run. Accepting personal transformation means recognizing that growth requires a shift in identity, not just behavior. You are not simply trying to do better. You are gradually becoming someone who naturally behaves differently. This shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of forcing actions that feel unnatural, you begin to align your actions with a new self-image. For example, someone trying to become more disciplined is not just forcing themselves to work harder. They are slowly changing the way they see themselves, from someone who struggles with consistency to someone who values structure. This internal change is what makes external behavior sustainable. However, transformation also requires leaving comfort zones behind. Comfort zones are not always comfortable in a positive sense. They are simply familiar environments where outcomes are predictable. Even if those outcomes are not ideal, they are known. Stepping outside this zone introduces uncertainty, which the mind naturally resists. The challenge is that growth rarely happens within familiar boundaries. If everything remains the same, results tend to remain the same. Leaving the comfort zone does not always mean making extreme changes. It can begin with small intentional shifts in behavior, thinking, or environment that gradually expand your capacity for change. Letting go of the old version of yourself often involves a quiet internal conflict. Part of you wants progress, while another part holds on to familiarity. This conflict is normal. It does not mean you are failing, it means you are transitioning. Identity does not change instantly. It dissolves gradually as new patterns become stronger than old ones. One important realization in this process is that you are not losing yourself, you are updating yourself. The old version of you was shaped by past conditions, limitations, and experiences. It served a purpose during that time. But as your awareness grows, your identity must also evolve to match your current direction. Many people resist this idea because they associate identity with permanence. They believe that changing too much means losing authenticity. But authenticity is not about staying the same. It is about aligning your actions with your current values and goals. When those values change, identity must also adapt. Letting go is not about rejection of your past. It is about understanding its role and then moving beyond it. You do not erase who you were. You stop letting it define who you must continue to be. This distinction is important because it removes unnecessary emotional resistance. As old habits begin to lose influence, space is created for new behaviors to form. At first, these new behaviors may feel unnatural or inconsistent. That is expected. Every new identity begins as an intentional effort before it becomes a natural expression. Over time, repetition strengthens this new direction until it feels like a stable part of who you are. Reinvention depends heavily on this stage of letting go. Without releasing old patterns, new growth is often blocked or delayed. With release, even small changes can create meaningful progress because they are no longer competing with outdated habits for control. Ultimately, letting go of the old version of yourself is not about becoming someone completely different. It is about removing the limitations that no longer reflect who you are becoming. It is a process of alignment, not replacement, and in that alignment, change stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like progress. Chapter 7. Rebuilding Discipline When You Feel Weak. One of the most misunderstood ideas in personal development is discipline. Many people believe discipline is about being strong, highly motivated, or consistently energetic. But in reality, discipline is not defined by how you feel. It is defined by what you continue to do, especially when you feel weak, tired, or unmotivated. There are phases in life when energy is low, not just physical energy, but emotional and mental energy as well. During these periods, even simple tasks can feel heavy. You may know what you should be doing, but knowing is not the same as acting. The gap between intention and execution becomes wider when motivation declines. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They assume that low energy means they are incapable of discipline. As a result, they stop trying altogether until they feel better. But this waiting period often extends longer than expected. Days turn into weeks, and weeks into months. The longer you wait for motivation, the more disconnected you become from structured living. Rebuilding discipline does not begin with intensity. It begins with simplicity. When life feels overwhelming or unstructured, the goal is not to transform everything at once. The goal is to create stability through small, repeatable actions. These actions may seem insignificant at first, but they serve a critical psychological function. They restore a sense of control. Starting even with low energy is the foundation of this process. Discipline is not about perfect conditions. It is about starting under imperfect conditions. You do not need to feel fully ready. You only need to begin at a level that is manageable. This could be something as small as waking up at a consistent time, organizing a small part of your environment, or completing a short task that you have been avoiding. The key is not intensity, but continuity. When you act even in a limited way, you send a signal to your mind that progress is still possible. This signal is important because low-energy periods often distort perception. They create the illusion that nothing can be done, even when small actions are still available. Building structure through small habits is one of the most effective ways to rebuild discipline. Structure does not have to be rigid or complicated. In fact, overly complex systems often fail during low motivation phases. Simple habits are more sustainable because they require less mental resistance. For example, instead of trying to redesign your entire routine, you focus on 1 or 2 consistent actions each day. These actions are not chosen for their impact alone, but for their repeatability. When repeated consistently, even small habits create a framework that gradually supports larger changes. What matters most in this stage is not how much you do, but whether you do it repeatedly. Consistency begins to rebuild trust between you and your own behavior. When you repeatedly follow through on small commitments, your mind begins to recognize you as someone who acts rather than someone who only intends. This is where consistency becomes more important than motivation. Motivation is unstable. It fluctuates based on mood, environment, stress, and external circumstances. If discipline depends on motivation, then progress becomes unpredictable. Some days will feel productive, while others will feel completely stagnant. Consistency removes this unpredictability. It creates a baseline of action that does not depend on emotional state. Even on low-energy days, consistent individuals do not aim for perfection. They aim for continuity. They understand that maintaining momentum is more important than maximizing output in a single moment. Slowly regaining control over life is not a dramatic process. It is gradual and often subtle. At first, the changes may feel insignificant. You might not notice immediate improvement in your circumstances. However, internally, something important begins to shift. You stop feeling completely disconnected from structure. Discipline is not just about productivity. It is about psychological stability. When your daily actions are inconsistent, life often feels chaotic, even if external conditions are stable. But when you introduce structure through consistent behavior, your internal state begins to stabilize, even if external challenges remain. This is why rebuilding discipline has a strong emotional component. It is not only about achieving goals, it is about reducing internal chaos. When you know what you are going to do each day, even in small ways, your mind experiences less uncertainty. This reduces stress and increases clarity over time. There is also an important truth that needs to be understood during this process. Setbacks are normal. Rebuilding discipline is not a linear path. There will be days when you fail to follow through. There will be moments when old patterns return. This does not mean the process is failing. It means the process is real. The key is not to interpret setbacks as complete failure. Instead, they should be seen as interruptions, not endings. A single disrupted day does not erase weeks of consistency. What matters is the overall direction, not isolated moments of inconsistency. Another important aspect of rebuilding discipline is self-perception. How you see yourself influences how you act. If you constantly see yourself as someone who lacks discipline, your behavior tends to follow that belief. But when you begin to act consistently, even in small ways, your self-perception begins to shift gradually. This shift does not happen instantly. It develops through repetition. Each time you follow through on a small commitment, you reinforce a new identity. Over time, this identity becomes stronger than the old narrative of inconsistency. You begin to see yourself as someone who is capable of structure, even if you are still in the process of building it. Rebuilding discipline when you feel weak is not about forcing extreme productivity. It is about restoring alignment between intention and action. It is about reducing the distance between what you say you will do and what you actually do. The process begins with acceptance of your current state. You acknowledge that energy may be low, motivation may be inconsistent, and circumstances may not be ideal. But instead of waiting for those conditions to change, You choose to act within them in small, manageable ways. Over time, these small actions accumulate. They create momentum, structure, and internal stability. And slowly, what once felt like weakness begins to transform into quiet strength, not because circumstances changed, but because your response to them did. This is how discipline is rebuilt. Not through intensity, but through consistency. Not through motivation, but through repetition. And not through perfect effort, but through continuous effort, even when you feel least capable of giving it. Chapter 8. Learning to start small. One of the biggest reasons people struggle to change their lives is not lack of desire, but the scale at which they try to change. When life feels unsatisfying or stagnant, the natural response is often to think in large terms. You want a major transformation, a completely new routine, a better job, a healthier body, or a more successful version of yourself. But the problem is not the desire for improvement. The problem is starting at a scale that your current life structure cannot support. When goals are too large, they create pressure instead of direction. Instead of motivating action, they create hesitation. The mind begins to compare where you are with where you want to be, and the distance feels overwhelming. That emotional gap often leads to delay, not because you are incapable, but because the starting point feels too far from the destination. This is why learning to start small is not just a strategy, it is a necessity for sustainable change. Small beginnings reduce emotional resistance. They make action possible even when motivation is low, time is limited, or life feels unstable. Small steps are not less important than big steps. They are what make big steps possible in the first place. Starting small means shifting your focus from outcomes to process. Instead of asking, "How do I completely change my life?" you begin asking, "What is one small action I can take today that moves me in the right direction?" This shift may seem simple, but it fundamentally changes how progress is experienced. Most people underestimate the psychological power of small actions. A single small action does not change your entire life immediately, but it changes your relationship with inertia. Inertia is the state of not moving, and it is often the biggest barrier to progress. Once you break inertia, even slightly, movement becomes easier. And once movement begins, direction can be adjusted over time. Focusing on daily improvement is more effective than focusing on large, distant goals. Daily improvement does not require perfection. It requires repetition. You are not trying to become someone different in one moment. You are trying to become slightly better each day in a consistent direction. Over time, these small improvements accumulate into significant change. One of the key psychological shifts in this process is accepting that progress is often invisible in the beginning. When you start small, the results are not immediately noticeable. This can create doubt if you are expecting fast transformation, but real change rarely appears instantly. It builds quietly in the background before becoming visible in outcomes. For example, if someone is trying to improve their financial situation, the instinct might be to think in terms of large goals, such as doubling income or finding a completely new career. While those goals may be valid, starting directly at that level can feel overwhelming. A smaller approach would focus on building one skill, improving one habit, or learning one new concept each day. Individually, these actions seem minor, but over time they increase capability, confidence, and opportunity. This principle applies to all areas of life. Whether it is health, learning, discipline, or emotional stability, small actions are the foundation of sustainable progress. The goal is not intensity, the goal is consistency. Micro-actions are particularly powerful because they reduce psychological resistance. When a task feels too large, the brain often delays it. But when a task is small enough, it feels manageable even on low-energy days. This is important because most people do not fail due to lack of ambition, but due to inconsistency during difficult periods. A micro-action could be something as simple as spending 10 minutes learning a skill, organizing a small space, writing a few lines of reflection, or completing a single task that has been delayed. These actions may appear insignificant, but they carry psychological weight. Each completed action reinforces the identity of someone who follows through. Momentum is built through repetition, not intensity. When you complete a small action, you create a sense of progress. That sense of progress increases the likelihood of repeating the behavior. Over time, repetition turns into habit, and habit turns into structure. This is how momentum develops quietly. Momentum is important because it reduces emotional friction. When you are in a state of inactivity, even small tasks feel heavy, but once momentum begins, the same tasks feel lighter. This is why starting is often the hardest part of any change process. The difficulty is not in maintaining action, but in initiating it. Patience plays a critical role in rebuilding life through small steps. Many people abandon this approach because they expect immediate results. When they do not see fast transformation, they assume the method is ineffective. But this expectation misunderstands how sustainable change actually works. Real growth is layered. It builds slowly through accumulated behavior. The early stages often feel slow because you are still building foundation rather than visible outcomes. Just like constructing a building, most of the effort in the beginning goes into preparation that is not immediately visible. Patience is not passive waiting. It is active consistency without immediate reward. It is the ability to continue small actions even when results are not yet visible. This mindset is essential because without it, most people stop too early in the process. Another important aspect of starting small is reducing emotional pressure. When goals are too large, every attempt feels high stakes. If you fail, it feels like significant loss. But when goals are small, failure becomes less intimidating. You can restart easily without emotional burden. This flexibility makes consistency more sustainable. Starting small also helps rebuild trust in yourself. Many people struggle with self-doubt because they have broken commitments to themselves repeatedly. Large goals often increase this cycle because they are harder to maintain. Small commitments, however, are easier to complete. Each completed action rebuilds self-trust gradually. Self-trust is one of the most important foundations of long-term change. When you trust yourself to follow through on small actions, you begin to trust yourself with larger responsibilities. This progression is natural and necessary. Without self-trust, even strong motivation eventually collapses. It is also important to understand that starting small is not permanent. It is a phase of rebuilding. Once consistency is established, actions naturally expand. Small beginnings are not limitations, they are entry points. They create stability that supports future growth. Many people underestimate how powerful simple actions become when repeated over time. A single small habit may seem insignificant in isolation, but when repeated daily, it begins to reshape identity, environment, and outcomes. This is the compounding effect of behavior. It is slow at first, but powerful over time. One of the biggest mindset shifts required in this stage is letting go of comparison with ideal outcomes. Instead of measuring yourself against where you think you should already be, you begin measuring yourself against your own consistency. Progress becomes about direction, not speed. For example, improving even 1% each day may not feel meaningful in the short term, but over time it creates noticeable change. The key is not the size of each step, but the continuity of movement. Starting small also teaches emotional resilience. It helps you continue even when life is not perfect. It removes the pressure of needing ideal conditions before acting. This is important because real life rarely offers perfect timing. Eventually, small actions begin to change your internal state. You become more organized, more focused, and more aware of your ability to influence outcomes. This shift does not happen because of one major decision, but because of repeated small decisions that align with improvement. Learning to start small is ultimately about redefining what progress means. It is about understanding that transformation is not a single event, but a process built through manageable steps. When you embrace this approach, change becomes less overwhelming and more realistic. And in that realism, progress finally becomes sustainable. Chapter 9. Turning pain into progress. Pain is something every person experiences, but not everyone understands how to use it. In most cases, emotional pain is seen as something to escape from, avoid, or suppress. People try to move past it as quickly as possible, hoping that time alone will erase it. But pain that is ignored does not disappear in a meaningful way. It often remains, quietly influencing thoughts, decisions, and self-belief in the background. What most people are never taught is that pain, when understood correctly, can become one of the most powerful drivers of personal growth. Not because pain is positive, but because it carries information. It reveals where expectations were broken, where decisions went wrong, where opportunities were missed, and where growth was needed, but not pursued. Turning pain into progress begins with a shift in interpretation. Instead of viewing pain as evidence of failure, you begin to see it as feedback. This does not mean denying the emotional weight of past experiences. It means changing how you relate to them. The experience itself may remain the same, but its meaning can change over time. Regret is one of the most common forms of emotional pain. It often comes from looking backward and realizing that a different decision might have led to a better outcome. Regret can feel heavy because it creates a sense of lost potential. The mind tends to focus on what could have been rather than what still can be changed. However, regret also contains clarity. It highlights what matters to you. People do not regret things that were meaningless to them. They regret the opportunities they valued but did not act on, the choices they avoided, or the risks they were afraid to take. In that sense, regret is not only about loss, it is also about awareness of priorities. The challenge is that many people stay trapped in regret instead of using it constructively. They replay past mistakes repeatedly, hoping to understand them fully, but without translating that understanding into action. Over time, regret becomes emotional weight instead of directional guidance. Using failure as a teacher requires a different mindset. Failure is often treated as a final judgment on ability or worth. But in reality, failure is simply an outcome that did not match intention. It is a signal that something in the approach, timing, preparation, or decision-making process needs adjustment. When failure is viewed this way, it becomes informational rather than personal. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the more useful question becomes, "What can I learn from this outcome?" This shift removes unnecessary self-judgment and replaces it with analysis. This does not mean failure stops being painful. Emotional discomfort is still present. But instead of allowing that discomfort to lead to avoidance, it becomes part of the learning process. The key is not to eliminate pain, but to prevent it from becoming stagnant. Emotional pain can also serve as fuel for change, but only when it is directed properly. Pain naturally creates energy in the form of discomfort, frustration, or dissatisfaction. If this energy is not guided, it often leads to withdrawal, overthinking, or self-doubt. However, when it is channeled, it can become motivation for improvement. The difference lies in direction. Pain without direction becomes overwhelming. Pain with direction becomes productive. Direction comes from clarity about what needs to change and what actions are required to create that change. For example, a person who loses an important opportunity may initially feel disappointment, frustration, or even embarrassment. The natural response may be to dwell on what went wrong or to avoid similar situations in the future. But over time, if the experience is processed differently, it can become a turning point. Instead of defining themselves by the loss, they begin to study it. They identify what preparation was missing, what skills were underdeveloped, or what decisions could have been improved. Eventually, that same experience becomes the foundation for stronger preparation in the future. The loss does not disappear, but its meaning changes. It becomes part of a learning structure rather than a permanent emotional burden. Reframing past mistakes into lessons is one of the most important skills in personal development. A mistake by itself is only an event. It becomes meaningful based on how it is interpreted. If interpreted negatively, it becomes a source of shame or avoidance. If interpreted constructively, it becomes a source of insight. Reframing does not mean justifying poor decisions or ignoring responsibility. It means extracting value from experiences that cannot be changed. This process allows you to move forward without carrying unnecessary emotional weight. Many people struggle with this because they associate self-worth with past performance. When something goes wrong, they internalize it as proof of inadequacy. This creates a cycle where fear of future mistakes leads to avoidance, and avoidance limits growth opportunities. Breaking this cycle requires separating identity from outcome. You are not defined by individual results. You are defined by your ability to respond, learn, and adjust. Outcomes are events. Identity is the pattern of response over time. When you begin to see mistakes as part of a larger learning process, your relationship with risk changes. You become more willing to act because failure no longer carries the same emotional threat. This does not eliminate caution, but it reduces paralysis. It is also important to understand that emotional recovery from pain takes time. Turning pain into progress is not an instant shift. It is a gradual process of reinterpretation. At first, emotional reactions are still strong. Over time, reflection becomes clearer and less emotionally charged. Eventually, what once felt like regret begins to feel like understanding. This transformation requires patience. People often expect immediate emotional resolution after deciding to move on, but emotional patterns are built over time, and they require time to change. The goal is not to rush this process, but to guide it in a healthier direction. One of the most practical ways to turn pain into progress is through action. Action interrupts overthinking. When you are engaged in constructive activity, your focus shifts from internal repetition of past events to present effort. This does not erase pain, but it prevents it from dominating mental space. Small actions are particularly effective in this stage. They create a sense of forward movement, even when emotional weight is still present. Over time, these actions rebuild confidence, not through avoidance of pain, but through persistence despite it. Another important aspect is learning to observe pain without becoming consumed by it. This means recognizing emotional responses without letting them dictate behavior. You acknowledge regret, disappointment, or frustration, but you do not allow these emotions to define your next step. This level of emotional awareness is a skill that develops gradually. At first, emotions feel automatic and overwhelming, but with practice you begin to create space between feeling and action. In that space, choice becomes possible. Turning pain into progress also involves redefining success. Instead of measuring success only by outcomes, you begin to measure it by growth. Did you learn something? Did you respond differently than before? Did you take action despite discomfort? These questions shift focus from external validation to internal development. This shift is essential because life will always include setbacks. No path is free from mistakes or unexpected challenges. If success is defined only by perfect outcomes, then disappointment becomes inevitable. But if success is defined by progress and learning, then even difficult experiences contribute to growth. A person who once lost an opportunity but later uses that experience to develop stronger skills, better preparation, and clearer direction is an example of this transformation. The initial pain does not vanish, but its function changes. It becomes a reference point for improvement rather than a symbol of limitation. Over time, this approach builds resilience. Not the kind of resilience that denies emotion, but the kind that integrates it into growth. You do not stop feeling pain, but you stop being controlled by it. Instead of resisting it, you use it as information. Ultimately, turning pain into progress is about reclaiming control over interpretation. You cannot always control what happens to you, but you can influence how those experiences shape your future. When pain is understood, processed, and directed, it becomes less of a burden and more of a guide. And in that shift, Even the most difficult experiences begin to contribute to a life that is still being built. Chapter 10. The life you can still build starts today. There is a moment in many people's lives when they quietly assume that their best chances have already passed. It does not always come as a clear thought. It often appears as a feeling, a sense that too much time has gone, too many mistakes have been made, or too many opportunities have been missed. This feeling can become so familiar that it starts to influence decisions without being questioned. But one of the most important truths in personal development is this: your past may explain your current position, but it does not determine your future direction. Hope is often misunderstood. Many people associate hope with wishful thinking or unrealistic optimism, but real hope is not about imagining a perfect future. It is about recognizing that change is still possible through action. Hope is not passive, it is directional. It points you toward what can still be built, not what has already been lost. No matter what age you are, what mistakes you have made, or how delayed your progress feels, the possibility of change does not disappear. What changes over time is not the availability of opportunity, but your willingness to engage with it. Life continues to present options in different forms, but those options only become meaningful when acted upon. The idea that reinvention has a deadline is one of the most limiting beliefs a person can carry. It creates the impression that if you have not achieved certain things by a specific age or stage, then change becomes less valid or less effective. But in reality, transformation is not restricted by age, it is restricted by inaction. What truly shapes your future is not your past, but your present decisions. Every future outcome is built from current behavior repeated over time. This means that even small changes today can begin to shift long-term direction. The problem is not that people lack ability. The problem is that they underestimate the importance of starting. Many individuals delay change because they are waiting for a better moment. A moment when circumstances feel easier, when confidence feels higher, or when fear disappears. But such a moment rarely arrives in the way people expect. Life does not pause to create ideal conditions for transformation. Instead, it continues with its responsibilities, uncertainties, and demands. This is why waiting becomes one of the most silent forms of stagnation. It feels harmless in the beginning because no visible damage is happening. But over time, waiting becomes a pattern. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, where intention remains unchanged, but action does not follow. Action is the real turning point in any reinvention process. Not thinking, not planning, not analyzing, but action. Thinking creates awareness, planning creates structure, but only action creates movement. Without action, even the clearest understanding remains theoretical. The moment you begin to act, even in a small way, something important shifts internally. You stop being only an observer of your life and start becoming a participant in it again. This shift may seem subtle, but psychologically it is significant. It restores a sense of agency, the feeling that your choices still matter. Many people underestimate how powerful small actions can be. They believe that only large, dramatic changes are meaningful. But in reality, transformation rarely begins with dramatic shifts. It begins with simple, consistent actions repeated over time. A single decision made differently today can gradually influence patterns that shape the future. The future is not something that arrives suddenly. It is constructed continuously through present behavior. Every habit, every decision, every response contributes to the direction you are moving in. This means that even if your past has been filled with delay, inconsistency, or regret, your present still holds the ability to redirect your path. One of the most important mindset shifts in reinvention is moving away from identity based on the past. Many people define themselves by previous outcomes, failures, missed opportunities, or periods of inactivity. This creates a fixed internal narrative that limits change before it begins. But identity is not fixed. It is shaped by repetition. When you consistently act in a new way, your sense of self begins to adjust. You are not permanently defined by who you were during your most difficult or unproductive phases. You are defined by the direction you choose to maintain going forward. This is why even small changes matter more than they initially appear. They are not just actions, they are signals. Each action sends a message to your mind that a different pattern is possible. Over time, these signals accumulate and begin to reshape self-perception. Reinvention does not require perfect conditions. It requires consistent direction. You do not need to have everything figured out before starting. In fact, clarity often comes after movement, not before it. Many people wait for clarity before acting, but clarity is often a result of action. When you begin to move, even in uncertainty, you start learning what works, what does not, and what needs adjustment. This feedback becomes the foundation for better decisions. Without movement, there is no feedback. Without feedback, there is no refinement. Hope becomes real when it is connected to behavior. Without action, hope remains abstract. With action, hope becomes practical. It becomes something you are actively building, rather than something you are waiting to feel. It is also important to understand that reinvention is not about becoming a completely different person overnight. It is about gradual alignment. It is about bringing your actions, habits, and decisions closer to the life you want to build. This process is incremental, not instantaneous. Many people stop themselves from starting because they believe change must be total to be meaningful. But meaningful change is often gradual. It builds quietly through repetition and adjustment. Over time, these small adjustments lead to noticeable transformation. Another important truth is that your past does not need to be erased for your future to improve. Your experiences, including mistakes and setbacks, can become part of your foundation. They can provide insight, awareness, and perspective that someone without those experiences may not have. What matters is not the presence of past mistakes, but your current relationship with them. If they define your limitations, they restrict your future. If they become lessons, they support your growth. The life you can still build is not dependent on where you started. It is dependent on what you choose to do from this moment onward. This is the core principle of reinvention. Direction matters more than history. There is a psychological turning point when a person stops seeing their future as a continuation of their past and starts seeing it as something that can be actively shaped. This shift does not require external validation. It requires internal decision. That decision is simple but powerful: to begin again in whatever form is currently possible. Starting does not erase difficulties. Life will still contain responsibilities, uncertainties, and challenges, but starting changes your relationship with those challenges. Instead of feeling like a passive observer, you begin to engage with them actively. This engagement creates momentum. Momentum is important because it reduces emotional resistance over time. Once movement begins, even slowly, it becomes easier to continue. The hardest part is not maintaining progress, it is initiating it. This is why today matters more than any ideal future moment. Waiting for a perfect time often delays the only time that truly exists: now. The present is the only space where decisions can be made and actions can be taken. Reinvention is always possible because change is built into the structure of human behavior. People are capable of learning, adapting, and adjusting throughout their lives. There is no fixed point at which growth becomes impossible. What changes is willingness, not capacity. Even if your progress feels delayed, even if your past feels heavy, and even if your current situation feels limiting, the ability to move in a new direction still exists. It does not require permission from the past. It only requires participation in the present. The life you can still build is not a distant concept. It is formed through the decisions you make today, not tomorrow, not after conditions improve, but now, because every future version of your life will always begin from the actions you take in this moment. And that is where reinvention truly begins. Not in theory, not in regret, not in planning, but in the simple, quiet decision to start again today. As this journey comes to an end, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned, not as theory, but as truth shaped by real life. You've seen how pressure builds silently, how time moves faster than intention, how fear quietly controls decisions, and how pain can be transformed into progress when it is understood instead of avoided. But the most important realization is this: nothing you've experienced so far has closed the door on your future. Time will continue to pass, whether you change or not. The difference is what you choose to do with the time that remains. Waiting will not slow life down. Thinking alone will not reshape it. Reinvention only begins when action replaces hesitation, even in the smallest form. You do not need a perfect moment. You do not need complete confidence. You only need a starting point that is honest enough to move you forward. Everything in this audiobook leads to one simple truth: your life changes the moment your decisions change. So don't wait for a sign, because this is already your moment of awareness. Take the first step today, even if it feels small, uncertain, or incomplete. Because small steps taken consistently will always outperform perfect plans never started. And as you move forward, remember this clearly: your new life is still ahead of you.